Behind the golden gates of Ravenshollow Palace, where centuries of tradition meet modern ambition, a single photograph would shatter the carefully constructed harmony of the most powerful royal family in Europe. Queen Consort Isabella had always lived in the shadow of her predecessor's memory, but when Princess Catherine's rising popularity began to eclipse her own influence, a desperate move would set in motion events that no one could have predicted. What started as jealousy would become a scandal that threatened the very foundation of the monarchy itself. This is the story of how one woman's insecurity nearly brought down a 1,000-year dynasty, and how a king's reaction would change the royal family forever. The truth behind the palace walls was far more complex than any tabloid could imagine, and the consequences would reach far beyond the ornate corridors where power was both inherited and earned. In a world where every gesture is scrutinized and every alliance matters, the battle for influence was about to begin. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Ravenshollow Palace as Queen Consort Isabella stood before the gilded mirror in her private chambers. At 58, she had learned to read the subtle language of power that existed within these ancient walls, but lately, that language had been speaking words she didn't want to hear. The previous evening's state dinner had been another reminder of how the dynamics were shifting. Princess Catherine, married to Crown Prince William for barely 3 years, had effortlessly commanded the attention of every foreign dignitary present. Isabella had watched from her position at the high table as Catherine's genuine laughter filled the grand dining hall, as ambassadors leaned in to catch her words, as cameras lingered on her radiant smile. "Your Majesty," came the voice of her private secretary, Margaret, as she entered with the morning papers. "The coverage from last night's dinner has arrived." Isabella didn't need to look at the headlines to know what they would say. For months now, the pattern had been the same. Catherine's charm, Catherine's fashion choices, Catherine's charitable work. The young princess had a natural grace that seemed to make everything she touched turn to gold in the eyes of the public and press. The queen consort had worked for decades to build her reputation after the difficult early years of her marriage to King Edward. When she first became his consort, the public had been skeptical, comparing her unfavorably to his beloved first wife, Queen Margaret, who had died tragically young in a car accident. Isabella had fought hard to win their acceptance, to prove herself worthy of the crown she now wore. But Catherine made it all look so easy. As Isabella flipped through the newspapers, her suspicions were confirmed. "Princess Catherine dazzles at state dinner," read one headline. "The People's Princess continues royal charm offensive," proclaimed another. In every photograph, Catherine looked radiant, confident, and utterly at home in her role. What stung most was not just the attention Catherine received, but how King Edward seemed to light up in her presence. Isabella had noticed it months ago, the way her husband's eyes crinkled with genuine pleasure when Catherine entered a room, the way he laughed at her jokes, the way he sought her opinion on matters of state. It wasn't romantic interest, Isabella knew that much. Edward was devoted to their marriage and to their children, Prince James and Princess Sophia. But there was something else, a recognition perhaps, of the natural royal bearing that Catherine possessed. It was the same quality that Edward's first wife had possessed, and Isabella could see that Edward saw it too. The irony was bitter. Isabella had spent years learning to be the perfect royal consort, studying protocol, practicing her public speaking, carefully crafting her image. She had transformed herself from a somewhat shy aristocrat into a polished representative of the crown. Yet here was Catherine, barely 30 years old, making it all seem effortless. Margaret cleared her throat delicately. "Your Majesty, there's also the matter of the upcoming charity gala. The planning committee has requested to meet with you this afternoon." Isabella nodded absently. The annual Royal Children's Foundation Gala was one of her signature events, something she had built from the ground up over the past 15 years. It was her chance to shine, to demonstrate her commitment to the causes that mattered to her. But even this felt threatened now. She had heard whispers that some committee members thought Catherine should take a more prominent role in the event. The thought sent a chill through her. This gala was hers. She had conceived it, nurtured it, watched it grow into one of the most important charitable events of the royal calendar. The idea of sharing that spotlight, or worse, having it overshadowed by Catherine's natural appeal, was almost unbearable. As she prepared for her day, Isabella's mind began to work. She was not a woman given to dramatic gestures or petty schemes, but desperation could drive even the most composed person to consider options they might normally dismiss. The public loved Catherine now, but public opinion was a fickle thing. Reputations could be built up, and They could be torn down just as quickly. Later that morning, Isabella made her way to the palace's east wing, where the administrative offices handled the day-to-day operations of royal life. Here, away from the grandeur of the staterooms, the real work of the monarchy took place. Press releases were crafted, schedules were coordinated, and information was carefully managed. She found herself in the office of Charles Whitmore, the palace's director of communications. Charles had been with the royal household for over 20 years and understood better than most how the delicate dance between the royals and the media worked. "Isabella," he said, rising from his desk as she entered. In private, away from formal protocol, they had developed a working relationship that allowed for more casual address. "What can I do for you?" "I've been thinking about the upcoming engagements," Isabella said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Particularly the Children's Foundation Gala. I want to ensure we're presenting the right image." Charles nodded. He was a thin man with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. "Of course. The event has always been a tremendous success under your leadership." "Yes, but I'm concerned about balance. The media attention has been somewhat uneven lately." Charles understood immediately what she was referring to. The palace staff had all noticed the shift in coverage toward Catherine. It wasn't unprecedented. New royals often generated excitement. But the intensity and duration of Catherine's popularity was remarkable. "What did you have in mind?" Charles asked carefully. Isabella had thought about this conversation for days, weighing her words. "I think it might be beneficial to provide some context about the younger generation's role in the family. Their inexperience, perhaps. The importance of established leadership in guiding charitable initiatives." It was a subtle suggestion, but Charles caught the implication immediately. Isabella was asking him to help shape a narrative that would emphasize her own experience and authority while subtly undermining Catherine's position. "That's certainly something we could consider," Charles said slowly. "Though we need to be very careful about the approach. The public has been quite taken with Princess Catherine." "Exactly my point," Isabella replied. "Sometimes public enthusiasm can be misguided. It's our responsibility to ensure they understand the full picture." After leaving Charles's office, Isabella felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. She hadn't explicitly asked him to plant negative stories about Catherine, but she had opened the door to that possibility. The palace's relationship with the media was complex, built on careful give and take. Favorable coverage could be encouraged, and unfavorable coverage could sometimes be discouraged, depending on the circumstances. The rest of her day proceeded normally. She attended a meeting with the trustees of one of her charities, reviewed plans for an upcoming state visit, and had lunch with Lady Patricia Ashworth, one of her oldest friends and a fellow royal enthusiast. "You seem distracted today," Patricia observed as they dined in Isabella's private sitting room. Patricia was one of the few people who could speak frankly with the Queen Consort, their friendship dating back to their school days. "Just the usual pressures," Isabella replied. But Patricia's knowing look suggested she wasn't fooled. "This is about Catherine, isn't it?" Patricia said gently. Isabella's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "I don't know what you mean." "Isabella, we've been friends for 30 years. I can see how this is affecting you. The girl is lovely, certainly, but you've earned your place here. Don't let a bit of media attention make you forget that." The words were comforting, but they also confirmed Isabella's fears. If Patricia could see her insecurity, others could too. The thought was humiliating. She prided herself on her composure, her ability to handle the pressures of royal life with grace and dignity. That evening, King Edward found her in the palace library, a room that had become her sanctuary over the years. She was sitting in her favorite armchair, a leather-bound book open in her lap, but her eyes were fixed on the fire crackling in the ornate fireplace. "You seem troubled," Edward said, settling into the chair beside her. Even after 15 years of marriage, he remained an imposing figure, tall and distinguished with silver hair and the bearing of a man born to rule. But with Isabella, he had always been gentle, understanding the pressure she faced as someone who had married into the royal family rather than being born to it. "Just thinking about the upcoming engagements," she said, which was technically true. Edward studied her face in the firelight. "The Children's Gala? Among other things. You know that's always been one of your greatest successes. The money you've raised, the awareness you've brought to children's causes, it's remarkable." Isabella felt a flush of pride at his words, but it was tempered by her ongoing concerns. "I just want to make sure it continues to have the impact it deserves." "It will," Edward said firmly. "Your dedication to those causes is one of the things I've always admired most about you." As they sat together in comfortable silence, Isabella felt a pang of guilt about the conversation she'd had with Charles earlier. Edward trusted her, loved her, believed in her abilities. Was she really going to jeopardize that by acting on her jealousies? But then, she thought about Catherine's effortless grace, about the way the public adored her, about how quickly 15 years of careful reputation building could be overshadowed by youth and natural charisma. The royal family was, at its core, about continuity and stability. Isabella had earned her place here, had worked for it, sacrificed for it. She deserved to protect what she had built. Later that night, alone in her chambers, Isabella made a decision. She would proceed carefully, subtly, but she would act. The stakes were too high to simply hope that things would balance out on their own. Catherine might be the future of the royal family, but Isabella was its present, and she intended to keep it that way. Outside her window, the lights of London twinkled in the distance, a city full of people who saw the royal family as symbols of tradition and stability. They trusted the royals to embody the best of their nation, to rise above petty concerns and personal ambitions. Isabella knew she was about to violate that trust, but she also knew that sometimes survival required difficult choices. Tomorrow, she would begin to take action. Tonight, she tried to convince herself that what she was planning was for the good of the monarchy, for the stability of the institution that she had sworn to serve. But, deep in her heart, she knew the truth was simpler and more human than that. She was afraid of being forgotten, and fear made people do desperate things. The morning after Isabella's late-night decision brought unexpected complications. As she reviewed her correspondence over breakfast, Margaret appeared with an expression that immediately put Isabella on alert. "Your Majesty, we have a situation," Margaret said, closing the door behind her with more force than usual. "Charles Whitmore has requested an urgent meeting with you." Isabella's heart skipped. Had Charles already acted on their conversation from yesterday? She had expected a more gradual approach, not immediate action. Did he say what this was regarding? No, but he seemed quite concerned. He mentioned something about developments that require your immediate attention. 20 minutes later, Isabella found herself back in Charles's office, but this time the atmosphere was entirely different. Charles looked haggard, as if he hadn't slept, and there was a tension in his posture that she had rarely seen before. "We have a problem," Charles said without preamble as soon as she was seated. "A significant one." Isabella felt her mouth go dry. "What kind of problem?" Charles opened a file on his desk and turned it toward her. Inside were several photographs, clearly taken with a telephoto lens from some distance. They showed Isabella herself, but in situations she didn't remember being photographed. One showed her leaving a private lunch with Lord Morrison, a controversial figure known for his criticism of certain royal protocols. Another captured her in what appeared to be an animated conversation with Henrietta Blackwood, a society columnist known for trading in royal gossip. Where did these come from? Isabella asked, though she was beginning to suspect the answer. "They were delivered to our offices this morning, along with a note," Charles said, sliding a piece of paper across the desk. The message was brief and typed. The Queen Consort should be more careful about her associations. The public might misunderstand. Isabella stared at the photographs, her mind racing. The lunch with Lord Morrison had been innocent, a discussion about a historical preservation project they were both involved in. The conversation with Henrietta had been equally harmless, small talk at a charity function. But, in the context of these secretly taken photographs, both meetings could be interpreted very differently. "This is blackmail," she said quietly. "It appears so," Charles agreed. "The question is, what does the sender want? And more importantly, who is it?" Isabella's first thought was that someone had discovered her conversation with Charles about Catherine and was trying to prevent her from acting. But that didn't make sense. No one else had been present during their discussion, and Charles certainly wouldn't betray her confidence. "Has anyone else seen these?" she asked. "Only you and me." The envelope was addressed specifically to my attention, marked confidential and urgent. Isabella studied the photographs again. They were professionally taken, which suggested someone with significant resources. The angles and timing indicated that the photographer had been following her, which was deeply unsettling. The royal family was accustomed to media attention, but this felt different, more threatening. "There's something else," Charles said reluctantly. "We received a call this morning from Marcus Webb at the Telegraph. He said someone had contacted him with interesting information about royal family dynamics. He wouldn't go into details, but he wanted to know if we had any comment." Isabella felt the walls closing in around her. Marcus Webb was one of the most respected royal correspondents in Britain, but he was also known for his investigative work. If someone was feeding him information, it could be devastating. What did you tell him? Nothing, of course. I said we'd get back to him if there was anything to comment on. But, Isabella, this feels coordinated. Someone is targeting you specifically. The irony was not lost on her. Yesterday, she had been planning to subtly undermine Catherine's position, and now she found herself under attack. But from whom? And why? I need to think about this, Isabella said, gathering the photographs. Don't mention this to anyone else for now. Of course. But, Isabella, if this escalates, we're going to need to involve the king. And possibly security. The thought of having to explain this situation to Edward filled Isabella with dread. How could she tell him about the photographs without also explaining the context of her recent actions and thoughts? He would want to know why someone might be targeting her, what she might have done to provoke this response. As she walked back to her chambers, Isabella's mind churned with possibilities. Who would have the resources and motivation to have her followed and photographed? The list of people with access to professional surveillance capabilities was limited, but the list of people who might have grievances against the royal family was considerably longer. She was so lost in thought that she almost collided with Catherine in the corridor outside the morning room. "Oh, Isabella, I'm sorry," Catherine said with her characteristic smile. "I didn't see you there." Looking at Catherine's fresh, open face, Isabella felt a surge of suspicion. Was it possible that Catherine herself was behind this? The timing seemed too coincidental. But, as quickly as the thought formed, Isabella dismissed it. Catherine was many things, but devious was not one of them. The young princess wore her emotions openly, and her genuine nature was one of the reasons the public loved her so much. "No harm done," Isabella replied, forcing a smile. "How are the preparations for the literacy program launch coming along?" "Wonderfully. The response from the schools has been overwhelming. I'm actually on my way to meet with the education minister now." As Catherine continued down the corridor, Isabella watched her go with a mixture of emotions. The girl truly was perfect for this role, Isabella had to admit. Her passion for her causes was genuine, her public presence was natural, and she seemed to genuinely care about the people she met during her engagements, which made Isabella's recent jealousy feel even more petty and unworthy. Back in her sitting room, Isabella spread the photographs out on her desk and studied them more carefully. The quality was professional, but there was something about the angles that seemed familiar. After a few minutes, she realized what it was. Several of the shots were taken from positions that would have required access to private areas around the locations where she was photographed. This wasn't just professional surveillance. This was someone with insider knowledge, someone who knew her schedule, her habits, her usual routes. The realization sent a chill through her. She reached for her private phone and dialed a number she rarely used. Robert Chambers answered on the second ring. "Isabella? This is unexpected." Robert was the head of palace security, a former military officer who took his responsibilities very seriously. She had worked with him on several occasions when security concerns had arisen around her charitable work. "Robert, I need to speak with you privately. Can you come to my sitting room?" "Of course. I'll be there in 10 minutes. When Robert arrived, Isabella showed him the photographs and explained the situation. His expression grew increasingly grave as he examined each image. "This is sophisticated work," he said finally. "Whoever did this has been planning it for some time. Look at the variety of locations and the quality of the shots. This represents weeks, possibly months of surveillance. But who would do this? And why?" Robert set down the photographs and looked at her directly. "Your Majesty, I need to ask some difficult questions. Have you been involved in anything recently that might have made someone want to discredit you? Any conflicts, any situations that might have created enemies?" Isabella felt heat rise in her cheeks. How could she explain her recent jealousy and her conversation with Charles without sounding petty and unprofessional? "Nothing significant," she said, though the lie felt obvious even to her. Robert's expression suggested he didn't entirely believe her, but he didn't press the issue. "I'm going to need to expand your security detail and conduct a full review of your recent activities. We'll also need to investigate how someone gained access to the areas where these photographs were taken." After Robert left, Isabella sat alone with the weight of her situation pressing down on her. In the space of 24 hours, her world had been turned upside down. Yesterday, she had been contemplating how to protect her position within the royal family. Today she was facing potential scandal and blackmail. The cruel irony was that her jealousy of Catherine now seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. Whatever threat she had posed to Catherine's rising star paled in comparison to the threat that now hung over her own reputation. That afternoon brought another complication. King Edward requested to see her in his private study, a room reserved for serious conversations. When she arrived, she found him standing by the window, looking out over the palace gardens with an expression she couldn't read. "I've just had an interesting conversation with Marcus Webb," Edward said without turning around. He seemed to think there might be some internal tensions within the family that the public should know about. Isabella's heart sank. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that any tensions he might have heard about were greatly exaggerated, and that the royal family remains united in its commitment to serving the British people." Edward turned to face her. "But I'd like to know what prompted his question." This was the moment Isabella had been dreading. She could continue to lie, to pretend that everything was normal, but Edward was not a stupid man. He had not survived decades in public life without developing an acute sense for when something was amiss. "There have been some challenges lately," she said carefully. "What kind of challenges?" Isabella sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs near Edward's desk. "The media attention around Catherine has been quite intense. There have been some suggestions that it might be affecting the balance of our public engagements." Edward's expression remained neutral, but she could see him processing this information. "And you've been concerned about this?" "I've been concerned about the institution," Isabella said, which was partially true. "About maintaining the proper hierarchy and respect for experience within the family structure." Edward was quiet for a long moment, and Isabella could practically see him connecting dots in his mind. He was likely thinking about her recent moods, her increased attention to media coverage, perhaps conversations he had overheard or meetings he had noticed. "Isabella," he said finally, "is there something specific you need to tell me?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implication. Isabella realized that this was her moment of choice. She could confess everything, tell him about her jealousy, about her conversation with Charles, about the photographs and the blackmail. She could throw herself on his mercy and hope that their marriage and his love for her would be enough to weather the storm. Or she could continue to try to handle this herself, to find a way out of the situation without involving him in what could become a very messy scandal. "I think there may be people who want to create problems for the family," she said, choosing a middle path. "People who see Catherine's popularity as an opportunity to drive wedges between us." It wasn't the whole truth, but it wasn't entirely false either. Edward studied her face for a long moment, and she could see him deciding how much to press her for details. "If that's the case," he said finally, "then we need to be very careful not to give them the ammunition they're looking for. Unity is our strength, Isabella. It's what allows us to serve effectively." As she left Edward's study, Isabella knew that she was running out of time. The photographs, the mysterious caller to Marcus Webb, her husband's growing suspicions, all of it was creating a perfect storm that threatened to destroy everything she had worked to build. But there was something else nagging at her, a detail about the photographs that she couldn't quite place. As she reviewed them again that evening, she realized what it was. In several of the shots, there was a reflection in a window or mirror that showed part of the photographer's equipment. The setup was too elaborate, too professional, for this to be the work of a lone blackmailer or tabloid photographer. Someone with serious resources was targeting her, and she still had no idea who or why. But she was beginning to suspect that her own recent actions might have been the catalyst that set this whole chain of events in motion. The question now was whether she could find a way to stop it before it destroyed not just her reputation, but the stability of the entire royal family. The third day of Isabella's crisis began with an emergency meeting she had not called. Margaret woke her at dawn with news that Charles Whitmore, Robert Chambers, and Edward's private secretary, Sir Geoffrey Hartwell, were requesting an urgent conference. The fact that Geoffrey was involved meant that the situation had already escalated to the highest levels of palace administration. Isabella dressed quickly and made her way to the Privy Council chamber, a room typically reserved for matters of state significance. The sight of the three men seated around the polished oak table filled her with dread. Their expressions were uniformly grave, and she noticed that Robert had brought a thick file with him. "Gentlemen," she said, taking her seat at the head of the table, "I assume this is about yesterday's developments." "I'm afraid it's considerably more serious than that," Geoffrey said. He was a man in his 60s who had served the royal household for over 30 years, and Isabella had never seen him look quite so troubled. "We've received additional information that suggests this situation is far more complex than we initially understood." Robert opened his file, and withdrew a new set of photographs. These were different from the ones Isabella had seen before, more recent, and they showed her entering and leaving Charles's office the day she had spoken with him about managing Catherine's media coverage. These arrived this morning, Robert explained, along with a transcript of what appears to be your conversation with Charles about Princess Catherine. Isabella felt the blood drain from her face. A transcript. Charles looked physically ill as he slid a typed document across the table. Isabella recognized her own words immediately, reproduced with devastating accuracy. Her suggestions about providing context about Catherine's inexperience, her request for Charles to shape media narratives, every damning word was there in black and white. "How is this possible?" she whispered. "My office was bugged," Charles said quietly. "We discovered the device this morning during a security sweep. It's sophisticated equipment, professionally installed, probably been there for weeks." Geoffrey leaned forward. "Your Majesty, we need to understand exactly what you were thinking when you made these requests. The implications of this transcript, if it were to become public, would be catastrophic." Isabella stared at the transcript, her mind reeling. Not only had someone been photographing her movements, they had been recording her most private conversations. The level of surveillance was far beyond what any tabloid or opportunistic blackmailer could arrange. "This feels like intelligence-level operation," Robert said, voicing what Isabella was thinking. "The equipment, the coordination, the strategic nature of what they've captured. This is not amateur work." "But who?" Isabella asked. "Who has this kind of capability and motivation?" Geoffrey and Robert exchanged a look that Isabella didn't like. Finally, Geoffrey spoke. "We've been wondering the same thing. The timing is particularly interesting. These surveillance activities appear to have begun shortly after Princess Catherine's engagement to Prince William was announced. The implication hung in the air. Someone had been planning this operation for years, waiting for the right moment to use whatever they gathered. But what was their endgame? Simple blackmail seemed insufficient given the resources they had invested. "There's more," Robert continued reluctantly. "We've identified at least 3 occasions where your security detail was deliberately misdirected, allowing the surveillance team clear access to photograph you. This required inside knowledge of our procedures and protocols." The revelation hit Isabella like a physical blow. Someone within the palace, someone with access to security information, was working against her. The betrayal felt almost worse than the surveillance itself. "Who?" she asked. "We're still investigating, but the number of people with the necessary access is quite limited. We're looking at approximately 15 individuals who would have had both the information and opportunity." Isabella tried to process this information while fighting off a wave of paranoia. 15 people. That could include her own staff, security personnel, even family members. How long had someone been watching her, recording her, waiting for her to make exactly the kind of mistake she had made with Charles? "Your Majesty," Geoffrey said gently, "we need to discuss how to proceed. The king will need to be informed of the full situation, and we'll need to develop a strategy for handling potential exposure." The thought of confessing everything to Edward filled Isabella with shame. How could she explain that her own jealousy and insecurity had led her to this point? That her attempt to undermine Catherine had instead created a vulnerability that now threatened the entire family? "Before we involve the king," Isabella said, "I need to understand what we're dealing with. Have there been any demands? Any indication of what the people behind this actually want?" "That's what's most troubling," Charles said. "Usually in blackmail situations, there are clear demands. Money, favors, specific actions. But, so far, there's been nothing except the implied threat of exposure." "Which suggests that exposure itself might be the goal," Geoffrey added. "Creating scandal, damaging the institution, undermining public confidence in the royal family." Isabella felt sick. She had been so focused on protecting her own position that she had inadvertently created exactly the kind of vulnerability that enemies of the monarchy would love to exploit. "There's one more thing," Robert said, hesitating. "We've detected similar surveillance activity around other members of the family. Princess Catherine, Prince William, even Prince James, and Princess Sophia have been photographed using the same professional techniques." This changed everything. Isabella had assumed she was being targeted specifically because of her actions, but if the surveillance was more widespread, it suggested a broader conspiracy against the royal family itself. "How extensive?" she asked. "We're still assessing the full scope, but it appears to be comprehensive. This operation has been documenting the private lives and activities of the entire royal family for an extended period." Isabella felt a mixture of relief and terror. Relief that she wasn't the sole target, terror at the implications of such an extensive intelligence operation against the monarchy. "We need to inform everyone immediately," she said. "If Catherine and William are also at risk." "Already in progress," Robert confirmed. Emergency security briefings are being conducted for all senior royals today. As the meeting concluded with plans for enhanced security and a comprehensive investigation, Isabella found herself facing an unexpected dilemma. The discovery of the broader surveillance operation meant that her own actions were part of a larger threat to the family. But it also meant that confessing her jealousy and her attempts to undermine Catherine might actually help the investigation. If the surveillance team had been waiting for exactly the kind of division she had been trying to create, then understanding her motivations might be crucial to understanding their strategy. That afternoon, Isabella made one of the most difficult decisions of her royal career. She requested a private meeting with Catherine. They met in Isabella's private sitting room, the same space where Isabella had made her fateful decision just days earlier. Catherine arrived looking concerned, but not suspicious, clearly believing this was about routine family matters. "Catherine, thank you for coming," Isabella began, gesturing for the younger woman to sit across from her. "I need to discuss something quite serious with you." "Of course," Catherine replied, her expression growing more attentive. Isabella had rehearsed this conversation in her mind, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself struggling with where to begin. How did one confess to jealousy and attempted sabotage to the very person they had targeted? "I want you to know that there are people trying to create problems for our family," Isabella said. "People who want to drive wedges between us and damage the institution we serve." Catherine nodded. "I've heard there have been some security concerns." "Yes, but there's more to it than that. These people are very sophisticated, and they're looking for any weakness they can exploit, any sign of division or conflict within the family." Isabella paused, watching Catherine's face carefully. The young woman was intelligent and perceptive. She would understand the implications of what Isabella was saying. "I need to be honest with you about something," Isabella continued. "I've been feeling challenged by the attention you've been receiving. The media coverage, the public response, it's been quite overwhelming, and I'm afraid I may have reacted poorly to it." Catherine's expression shifted slightly, becoming more understanding than surprised. "Isabella, I hope you know that I've never wanted to overshadow anyone. If I've done something inappropriate—" "No," Isabella said quickly. "You've done nothing wrong. Everything you've achieved, you've earned through your own efforts and natural abilities. The problem has been entirely with my own insecurity." It was perhaps the most honest thing Isabella had said in weeks, and she felt a strange relief in admitting it. "I've been worried," Catherine said quietly, "that I was somehow causing problems for you. I've noticed some tension, and I've been trying to be more careful about not stepping on anyone's toes." Isabella felt a pang of guilt. Catherine had been aware of the tension and had been trying to minimize it, while Isabella had been plotting to make it worse. "You shouldn't have to worry about such things," Isabella said. "You're a member of this family, and you deserve to shine in your own right." They talked for nearly an hour, and Isabella found herself genuinely liking Catherine for the first time since the younger woman had joined the family. Beneath the media-perfect exterior was a thoughtful, caring person who was genuinely concerned about doing right by everyone around her. But their conversation was interrupted by an urgent knock on the door. Margaret entered with an expression of barely controlled panic. "Your Majesty, forgive the interruption, but you need to see this immediately." She handed Isabella a tablet displaying the front page of the Telegraph's online edition. The headline made Isabella's blood run cold. "Palace Insider Reveals Royal Family Tensions. Secret Recording Exposes Queen Consort's Campaign Against Princess Catherine." The article, written by Marcus Webb, contained excerpts from the transcript of her conversation with Charles. Not the entire transcript, but carefully selected quotes that painted her in the worst possible light, while providing just enough context to seem credible. Catherine read over Isabella's shoulder, her face growing pale as she absorbed the implications of what she was seeing. "Is this true?" Catherine asked quietly. Isabella met her eyes directly. "Yes. I'm so sorry, Catherine. I was jealous and afraid, and I made a terrible mistake." The next few hours passed in a blur of emergency meetings, crisis management sessions, and frantic attempts to control the damage. The story was spreading rapidly across social media, with #RoyalRift and #PalaceConspiracy trending worldwide. King Edward's reaction, when he was finally briefed on the full situation, was a mixture of disappointment, anger, and profound concern for the institution he had spent his life protecting. How could this happen? He asked Isabella when they were finally alone together in his study. How could we have been so vulnerable? Isabella told him everything. Her jealousy, her conversation with Charles, her growing paranoia about Catherine's popularity, every shameful detail. Edward listened without interrupting, his face growing more grave with each revelation. The worst part, Isabella concluded, is that in trying to protect my position, I've endangered everything we've worked to build. And I've hurt Catherine, who never did anything except excel at the role she was given. Edward was quiet for a long time after she finished. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with sadness. Isabella, I've always admired your strength, your dedication to duty, your ability to handle the pressures of this life. But this is not the woman I married. The words hit Isabella harder than any anger could have. She had disappointed the man she loved, betrayed his trust, and potentially damaged the institution they both served. I know, she said. I don't know how to fix this. Neither do I, Edward replied. But we're going to have to find a way, because the alternative is unthinkable. As night fell over Ravenshollow Palace, the royal family found itself facing its greatest crisis in decades. The surveillance, the leaked transcript, the public revelation of internal tensions, all of it threatened to undermine the carefully maintained image of unity and stability that was essential to their role. But perhaps most devastating of all was the knowledge that the crisis had been largely self-inflicted, born from human failings that had made them vulnerable to their enemies. The question now was whether they could find a way to rebuild what had been broken, or whether Isabella's moment of weakness would prove to be the beginning of the end for the monarchy itself. The morning after the Telegraph story broke, Isabella woke to discover that the palace was under siege. Television trucks lined the streets outside the gates, reporters shouted questions at anyone entering or leaving the grounds, and social media had exploded with speculation about the royal family's internal dynamics. But the external pressure was nothing compared to the tension within the palace walls themselves. Isabella found King Edward in the map room, a small private office where he often went when he needed to think through complex problems. He was standing over a centuries-old table that displayed a detailed map of the British Isles, but she could tell his mind was far from geographical considerations. The Prime Minister called, Edward said without looking up. She's concerned about the political implications if this crisis continues to escalate. There are already questions being raised in Parliament about the cost of maintaining the monarchy during times of internal discord. Isabella felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders like a physical burden. Her personal failings were now threatening the very existence of the institution that had endured for over 1,000 years. What did you tell her? That we're handling the situation internally and that the monarchy remains committed to serving the British people with unity and dignity. Edward finally looked at her. I hope that's not a promise I'll regret making. Before Isabella could respond, there was a knock at the door. Geoffrey Hartwell entered with the morning briefing papers, his expression even more grave than usual. Your Majesties, we have new developments. 3 more news outlets have received what appear to be additional materials related to the surveillance operation. They're all asking for official comment before publication. Edward sank into a chair. What kind of materials? We don't have full details yet, but it appears to include more photographs and possibly additional recordings. The scope suggests that whoever is behind this has been documenting royal family activities far more extensively than we initially realized. Isabella felt nauseous. How many more of her private moments had been captured? How many more embarrassing or potentially damaging revelations were waiting to be exposed? There's also been a development with the investigation into the palace insider, Geoffrey continued. Robert Chambers has identified a person of interest among the communications staff. This news provided a small measure of relief. If they could identify the source of the leak, they might be able to understand the full scope of the threat and potentially prevent further damage. Who? Edward asked. Thomas Hartley, one of the junior communications assistants. He had access to Charles Whitmore's office systems and would have had the opportunity to install surveillance equipment. More significantly, his financial records show several large deposits over the past 6 months that don't correspond to his salary or any known legitimate income. Isabella remembered Thomas vaguely, a young man in his late 20s who had joined the palace staff about a year earlier with excellent references and an impressive educational background. The idea that someone so close to their daily operations had been working against them was deeply unsettling. Where is he now? Edward asked. That's the problem, Geoffrey replied. He called in sick yesterday and hasn't been seen since. His flat appears to have been cleared out hastily. We're working with security services to locate him, but he seems to have anticipated exposure. The revelation that their betrayer had escaped added another layer of frustration to an already impossible situation. Without Thomas in custody, they had no way of knowing how much information had been compromised or who else might be involved in the operation. Your Majesties, Geoffrey continued, we need to make some decisions about public response. The longer we remain silent, the more the narrative becomes controlled by outside forces. Isabella knew he was right. In the absence of an official response, speculation and rumor would continue to fill the void. But what could they possibly say that would improve their situation? What are our options? Edward asked. We could issue a statement denying the allegations in the transcript, but that would be problematic given that the recording appears to be authentic. We could acknowledge the surveillance, but frame it as an attack on the monarchy by unknown forces. Or, Geoffrey paused, clearly reluctant to continue. Or, Isabella prompted, we could consider a more dramatic response. A complete acknowledgement of the situation, a public apology, and a commitment to transparency and reform. It would be unprecedented, but it might allow us to control the narrative rather than being controlled by it. The idea of a public confession filled Isabella with terror, but she could see the logic in Geoffrey's suggestion. The royal family's strength had always come from their moral authority, their ability to represent the best values of their nation. If that authority had been compromised, perhaps the only way to restore it was through complete honesty. I need to speak with Catherine and William, Isabella said suddenly. Before we make any decisions about public response, I need to talk to the people most affected by my actions. Edward nodded. I think that's wise. They deserve to hear directly from you about what happened and what we're planning to do about it. An hour later, Isabella found herself in the most difficult conversation of her royal career. Catherine and William sat across from her in the same sitting room where she had first decided to act against Catherine's rising popularity. The irony of the location was not lost on any of them. William spoke first. His normally composed demeanor showed cracks of strain, and Isabella could see that the stress of the situation was affecting him deeply. I need to understand exactly what happened, he said. Not the public relations version, not the palace spin. I need to know what my family is being accused of and whether those accusations are true. Isabella had prepared for this moment, but facing William's direct gaze made her realize that no amount of preparation could make this easy. William was not just Catherine's husband. He was also Edward's heir, the future king. His opinion of her actions would have consequences far beyond this immediate crisis. The accusations are largely true, Isabella said, deciding that complete honesty was the only viable approach. I was jealous of Catherine's popularity and success. I was afraid that her natural gifts were overshadowing my own contributions to the family, and I made the terrible decision to try to do something about it. She walked them through the entire sequence of events, from her growing resentment to her conversation with Charles to the discovery of the surveillance operation. Catherine listened without comment, but Isabella could see tears forming in her eyes. I never meant to hurt you personally, Catherine, Isabella continued. My actions were driven by my own insecurities, not by any fault of yours. You've been nothing but gracious and supportive since joining this family, and you didn't deserve to be treated as a threat. When Isabella finished, the room fell into silence. William and Catherine exchanged a long look, and Isabella could see them having some kind of wordless communication. Finally, Catherine spoke. I wish you had talked to me directly. If you were feeling overshadowed or concerned about roles and responsibilities, we could have worked something out together. That's what families do. The simple kindness of Catherine's response made Isabella's guilt even more acute. Here was a woman who had been targeted and betrayed, and her first instinct was to offer understanding and solutions rather than anger and recrimination. You're right, Isabella said. I should have trusted you enough to be honest about my concerns. Instead, I let my fears drive me to actions that have hurt everyone I care about. William leaned forward. The question now is what we do going forward. This crisis isn't just about personal relationships anymore. It's about the survival of the monarchy itself. Isabella nodded. I know, and I take full responsibility for creating this vulnerability. Taking responsibility is important, William said, but it's not enough. We need a path forward that protects the institution while acknowledging what happened. Over the next hour, they discussed various options for responding to the crisis. Catherine, despite being the victim of Isabella's machinations, proved to be the most pragmatic in her thinking about solutions. The public needs to see that we're a real family with real problems, but also that we're capable of working through those problems together, Catherine said. Maybe this crisis is actually an opportunity to show a more human side of the monarchy. It was a remarkably mature perspective from someone who had every right to be angry and hurt. Isabella found herself wondering if Catherine's natural grace extended even to forgiveness. What are you suggesting? William asked. I'm suggesting that we consider doing something unprecedented. A joint public appearance where we acknowledge what happened and demonstrate that we've moved past it. Show the public that the royal family can overcome internal conflicts and emerge stronger. Isabella was stunned by the generosity of the proposal. Catherine was essentially offering to help rehabilitate the reputation of the very person who had tried to undermine her. You don't have to do that, Isabella said. This is my mistake to fix. But it's our family that's being damaged, Catherine replied. And our family's future that's at stake. We either work together to solve this, or we all suffer the consequences separately. Later that evening, the extended royal family gathered for an emergency meeting to discuss their response strategy. In addition to Isabella, Edward, William, and Catherine, the meeting included Prince James, Princess Sophia, and several senior advisors. Edward outlined the various options they had discussed, from denial to admission to Catherine's proposal for a joint public response. The room was divided on the best approach. Prince James, Edward's younger brother and a military veteran, favored a more aggressive response. We should treat this as what it is, an attack on the monarchy by hostile forces. Frame it as espionage and focus on the invasion of privacy rather than the content of what was recorded. Princess Sophia, Edward's sister and a longtime royal advocate, disagreed. That approach makes us look defensive and evasive. The public isn't stupid. They can see that there was real conflict here, and pretending otherwise will just make us look dishonest. Geoffrey Hartwell presented polling data that had been conducted overnight. The results were sobering. Public support for the monarchy had dropped significantly since the story broke, with particular damage to Isabella's personal approval ratings. But perhaps more troubling was the data showing that a significant portion of the public was questioning whether the royal family was worth maintaining if they couldn't manage their own internal relationships. The numbers suggest that our response needs to address not just this specific crisis, but broader questions about the monarchy's relevance and value, Geoffrey explained. The public is looking for evidence that we can provide the kind of moral leadership they expect from their royal family. As the meeting continued late into the night, Isabella found herself increasingly convinced that Catherine's approach was the right one. A joint appearance that acknowledged the conflict but demonstrated reconciliation would show the public that the royal family could overcome adversity together. But such an approach would require Isabella to make a public admission of her failings, something that went against every instinct of royal protocol and personal pride. If we do this, Edward said finally, there's no going back. Once we acknowledge the conflict publicly, we can't pretend it never happened. We'll be forever associated with this crisis. We're already forever associated with it, Isabella replied. The question is whether we'll be associated with the problem or with the solution. As the meeting concluded, they agreed to spend one more day considering their options before making a final decision. But Isabella had already made up her mind. She had created this crisis through her own weakness and selfishness. Now she would face the consequences of her actions with the same courage and dignity that the monarchy demanded. The next morning would bring either the beginning of their recovery or the deepening of their downfall. Either way, Isabella was determined to meet it with honesty and grace, even if it cost her everything she had worked to achieve. The morning of what would become known as the Reconciliation Address dawned gray and drizzly, matching the somber mood within Ravenshollow Palace. Isabella stood before her mirror, adjusting her pearl necklace with trembling fingers, knowing that in just a few hours she would face the British public and confess to failures that went against everything she had been taught about royal dignity and composure. Margaret had laid out a navy blue dress that struck the right balance between formality and accessibility, along with the emerald brooch that had belonged to Edward's first wife. Isabella had initially hesitated to wear it, given the circumstances, but Catherine had specifically requested that she do so. It represents continuity and forgiveness, Catherine had said during their final preparation meeting the previous evening. Queen Margaret believed in second chances, and I think she would want her memory to be part of healing rather than division. The gesture had moved Isabella to tears, yet another example of Catherine's extraordinary grace under pressure. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Edward entered, already dressed in his formal morning suit, his expression a mixture of support and nervousness. "The media has assembled in the blue drawing room," he said. "Jeffrey estimates about 50 journalists, plus the television crews for live broadcast. The international media interest has been extraordinary." Isabella nodded, though the thought of facing such a large audience made her stomach churn. They had decided on a controlled indoor setting rather than the traditional outdoor podium, hoping to create a more intimate atmosphere that would better serve their message of family reconciliation. "How is Catherine?" Isabella asked. "Remarkably calm, actually. She's been coaching William on his remarks, making sure his tone strikes the right balance between support for you and acknowledgement of the seriousness of the situation." The plan they had developed was unprecedented in royal history. Rather than having Isabella face the media alone, the entire core family would appear together. Edward would speak first, providing context and accepting institutional responsibility. Then, Isabella would deliver her personal confession and apology. Catherine would follow with remarks about forgiveness and moving forward. And finally, William would speak about the lessons learned and their commitment to serving with renewed unity. "Isabella," Edward said, taking her hands in his. "Once we do this, everything changes. The old model of royal privacy and mystique will be gone forever. We'll be a more transparent, more accountable monarchy, but also a more vulnerable one." "I know," Isabella replied. "But perhaps that's what the institution needs. Perhaps the old way of doing things created the conditions for this crisis in the first place." Edward studied her face. "You understand that this could end your royal career? The public might forgive, but they might also decide that you can no longer effectively represent them." It was a possibility Isabella had been wrestling with for days. The traditional response would have been for her to quietly withdraw from public life, perhaps taking an extended retreat while the scandal faded from memory. But that approach would have left the broader questions about royal transparency and accountability unanswered. "If that's the price of preserving the institution," Isabella said, "then I'm prepared to pay it." They made their way through the palace corridors together, passing staff members who offered small nods of encouragement. Isabella had been touched to discover that many of the palace employees had expressed support for her decision to face the crisis honestly, despite the chaos it had created in their work environment. In the anteroom adjacent to the blue drawing room, they met with Catherine and William for a final coordination meeting. Catherine looked composed but pale, while William showed signs of the strain he had been under for the past several days. "Any last changes to the remarks?" Jeffrey asked, reviewing his notes one final time. "I want to add something about the investigation," William said. "The public deserves to know that we're taking the security breach seriously and that we're working with authorities to ensure this kind of surveillance doesn't happen again." Jeffrey nodded. "That's good. It reinforces that you were victims of an operation rather than just participants in family drama." Charles Whitmore appeared in the doorway, looking haggard but determined. His own role in the crisis had made him a target of criticism, but he had insisted on maintaining his position and helping to manage the response. "We're ready for you," he announced. "The live broadcast begins in 2 minutes." As they prepared to enter the drawing room, Isabella felt Catherine's hand squeeze her arm gently. "Remember," Catherine said quietly, "we're all in this together. You're not facing this alone." The blue drawing room had been transformed into a makeshift press conference venue, with cameras, lighting equipment, and rows of chairs for the assembled journalists. Isabella was struck by how many faces she recognized, veteran royal correspondents who had covered her activities for years, now gathered to witness what might be her most consequential public moment. They took their positions behind a mahogany table that had been used for royal press conferences for decades. Edward sat in the center, with Isabella to his right, and Catherine and William to his left. The symbolism was deliberate, showing family unity while acknowledging the central roles of the key players in the crisis. Edward began with measured words that acknowledged the unusual nature of the gathering and the serious circumstances that had prompted it. He spoke about the monarchy's commitment to serving the British people with integrity and transparency, and his personal responsibility as head of the family to ensure that commitment was honored. "In recent days," Edward said, looking directly into the cameras, "information has emerged about internal family dynamics that has raised questions about our unity and our fitness to serve. While some of this information was obtained through illegal surveillance and invasion of privacy, we cannot and will not hide behind those circumstances to avoid addressing the substance of what has been revealed." He then introduced Isabella and She felt her heart racing as she leaned toward the microphone. The prepared remarks she had memorized suddenly felt inadequate, and she decided to speak from the heart. I stand before you today to acknowledge serious errors in judgment that I have made. Isabella began, her voice stronger than she had expected. Recent reports have accurately described conversations and actions on my part that fell short of the standards expected of someone in my position. She paused, looking out at the assembled journalists, many of whom she had worked with professionally for years. I allowed personal insecurity and jealousy to cloud my judgment regarding my daughter-in-law, Princess Catherine. Instead of celebrating her natural gifts and the positive attention she brought to our family's work, I saw her success as a threat to my own position. This was wrong. It was unworthy of my role, and it was unfair to Catherine, who has brought nothing but honor and dedication to her service. Isabella could see some of the journalists taking notes furiously, while others simply stared, clearly surprised by the directness of her confession. I want to be clear that Princess Catherine was not aware of my feelings or my actions. She has conducted herself with grace and professionalism throughout, even when faced with the revelation of my betrayal of her trust. The failure was mine alone. She went on to describe the conversation with Charles Whitmore, taking full responsibility for attempting to manipulate media coverage. She acknowledged the damage her actions had caused to family relationships and to public confidence in the monarchy. I cannot undo what I have done, Isabella concluded, but I can commit to learning from these mistakes and working to rebuild the trust one have damaged. I ask for your patience and for the opportunity to demonstrate through my future actions that this failure does not define who I am or who I can become. When Isabella finished, Catherine stepped forward to the microphone. Her remarks were brief but powerful, emphasizing forgiveness, the importance of learning from mistakes, and her continued commitment to working alongside Isabella for the good of the causes they both served. Family relationships are complicated, Catherine said, and families that serve in public face unique pressures. What matters is not that we have conflicts, but how we resolve them and what we learn from them. I have complete confidence that we will emerge from this experience stronger and more united than before. William's remarks focused on institutional accountability and the lessons the royal family would take from the crisis. He announced the implementation of new transparency measures, including regular public reporting on royal activities and finances, and the establishment of an independent oversight committee to review royal household operations. The question and answer session that followed was intense but respectful. The journalists pressed for details about the surveillance operation, about the timeline of Isabella's actions, and about what consequences she might face. Isabella answered each question directly and honestly, refusing to deflect or minimize her responsibility. One question, from veteran correspondent Sarah Mitchell, cut particularly deep. Your Majesty, given the damage this has caused to the monarchy's reputation, have you considered whether the appropriate response might be to step back from public life entirely? Isabella had been expecting this question, but hearing it asked directly still made her chest tighten. That decision ultimately rests with the king and with the judgment of the British people, Isabella replied. I believe I can continue to serve effectively, but I understand that trust must be earned through actions, not words. I am prepared to accept whatever consequences my actions have merited. The press conference lasted just over an hour, and when it concluded, Isabella felt simultaneously exhausted and relieved. The worst was now public knowledge, and there were no more secrets waiting to be revealed by hostile forces. The reaction was swift and divided. Initial polling showed that while public trust in Isabella had indeed been damaged, her willingness to accept responsibility and apologize publicly had resonated with many people. Editorial responses ranged from calls for her resignation to praise for her unprecedented honesty. But perhaps more important than the immediate public reaction was the response from within the family itself. That evening, as they gathered for a quiet dinner away from the media attention, Isabella felt a sense of peace that had been absent for weeks. I'm proud of you, Edward said as they sat together in their private dining room. What you did today took tremendous courage. Catherine and William had both expressed similar sentiments throughout the day, and Isabella was beginning to believe that the family relationships damaged by her actions might indeed be reparable. The investigation into the surveillance operation continued, with Thomas Hartley eventually apprehended trying to leave the country. His interrogation revealed connections to a foreign intelligence service that had been conducting a long-term operation designed to destabilize the British monarchy. Isabella's jealousy had provided exactly the kind of internal division they had hoped to exploit. In the weeks that followed, the royal family began implementing the transparency measures William had announced. Public approval ratings gradually recovered, and Isabella found that her new role as a more accountable and accessible royal actually suited her better than the distant formality she had maintained before. The Children's Foundation Gala, when it was finally held 6 months later, was a tremendous success. Isabella and Catherine appeared together as co-hosts, their public reconciliation serving as a powerful symbol of the monarchy's ability to evolve and grow. Standing on the stage that night, looking out at an audience that included many of the same journalists who had witnessed her confession, Isabella reflected on how completely her life had changed. The crisis that had begun with jealousy and insecurity had ultimately led to a more honest, more sustainable way of serving the public. She caught Catherine's eye and saw in the young woman's smile not just forgiveness, but genuine affection. They had become true partners in service, united by their shared commitment to the causes they championed and by their understanding of the unique pressures of royal life. King Edward's initial shock and disappointment had given way to respect for Isabella's courage in facing her failures publicly. Their marriage had been tested, but had ultimately emerged stronger, built on a foundation of complete honesty that hadn't existed before. As the gala concluded and Isabella prepared to return to the palace, she realized that her greatest fear, being forgotten or overshadowed, had been replaced by something far more valuable. She had found her authentic voice as a royal, one that acknowledged human frailty while maintaining dignity and purpose. The monarchy would continue to evolve, becoming more transparent, more accountable, and more connected to the people it served. And Isabella would be part of that evolution, not as someone trying to protect her position at all costs, but as someone committed to earning her place through genuine service. The crisis that had nearly destroyed her had instead transformed her, proving that even the most devastating failures could become the foundation for something better. In the end, it was not perfection that the public wanted from their royal family, but authenticity, integrity, and the wisdom to learn from mistakes. Isabella had learned that lesson the hardest way possible, but she had learned it completely. And in that learning, both she and the institution she served had found a path toward a more honest and sustainable future.